Please don't let her wander into the VIP area, my daughter whispered to the wedding planner while I stood 5 feet away holding a tray of champagne glasses. I pretended not to hear her. At 68 years old, I had learned that the deepest humiliations in life were rarely shouted. Most of them arrived quietly, dressed in polite smiles and lowered voices. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end. And let me know where you're watching from, because sometimes the people who hurt us most are the very ones we once would have died for. My daughter Claire's wedding was being held at the Ashford Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago, one of those places with crystal chandeliers hanging from ceilings 30 feet high and marble floors polished so brightly they reflected the light like water. The kind of place Claire used to point at in bridal magazines years ago and say, "One day, Mom." I arrived 2 hours early wearing a navy blue dress I had carefully chosen 3 months ago. It wasn't expensive, but the fabric was elegant, and the pearl earrings I wore had belonged to my late husband, Thomas. I spent nearly 40 minutes curling my silver hair that morning, wanting to look beautiful for my daughter's special day. When I walked through the side entrance carrying the small garment bag Claire had asked me to bring, a young woman with a clipboard looked at me quickly and said, "Kitchen staff goes downstairs, ma'am." I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could speak, Claire appeared at the end of the hallway in her silk robe, holding a mimosa in one hand and her phone in the other. "Mom, there you are," she said quickly. Relief warmed my chest for half a second until she added, "Can you just stay near the catering area for now? The photographers are setting up." I stood still, trying to understand what she meant. "Near the catering area?" I repeated softly. Claire avoided my eyes while adjusting one of her diamond earrings. "It's just really hectic out there right now, and Daniel's family is arriving soon. I need everything to look organized." Organized. Such a harmless word. Such a cruel one, too. I nodded slowly because I didn't want to create stress for her. Wedding day? That was what mothers did, wasn't it? We swallowed discomfort to make life easier for our children. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with activity. Servers rushed past carrying silver trays filled with shrimp cocktails and champagne flutes. Someone was slicing lemons at lightning speed, while another woman yelled table numbers over the sound of clattering dishes. The air smelled like butter, garlic, and expensive perfume drifting down from the ballroom above. One of the waitresses smiled kindly at me. "You with the evening staff?" she asked. I looked down at myself. My navy dress suddenly felt too plain. Too old. "Something like that," I answered quietly. About 20 minutes later, I stepped into the hallway searching for the restroom when I heard Claire's voice around the corner. "Please," she whispered sharply, "just keep her away from the guests until dinner starts. Better they think she's staff than ask questions about her." The hallway went silent after that. I felt my fingers tighten around the strap of my purse. For a moment, I honestly thought maybe I had misunderstood her. Maybe there was another woman she meant. But then someone laughed softly, and Claire sighed. "I just don't want a night ruined." Ruined. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to steady myself against the wall. Upstairs, violins began playing softly as guests entered the ballroom. Somewhere beyond those golden doors, my daughter was smiling proudly beside people she considered important. And downstairs, hidden beside industrial refrigerators and stacks of dinner plates, stood the woman who had spent 30 years building her life one sacrifice at a time, so Claire could have everything she ever wanted. For the next hour, I stayed downstairs beside the kitchen while the wedding unfolded above me like a party happening on another planet. Every few minutes, the elevator doors opened and another wave of laughter drifted into the service hallway before disappearing again. I could hear the faint music from the ballroom ceiling above us. Soft piano, glasses clinking, the muffled voice of a man announcing table assignments. Life continuing beautifully somewhere I apparently no longer belonged. I sat at a narrow metal table near the coffee station, holding a paper cup that had gone cold in my hands. Across from me, two young servers folded napkins while whispering about the guests upstairs. One of them smiled politely at me. "You have family at the wedding?" she asked casually. The question caught me off guard. I looked toward the ceiling for a moment before answering. "Yes," I said quietly. "My daughter." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh, bride's side." I nodded once. Neither girl said anything after that. They exchanged a quick glance before returning to their napkins. It was not cruelty. It was discomfort. People never know what to do when they witness humiliation happening slowly. Around 6 o'clock, I finally walked upstairs to look for my seat before the ceremony began. Guests filled the ballroom now, dressed in black tuxedos and shimmering gowns that reflected the chandelier light like water. Waiters floated between tables carrying trays of champagne. Everything looked exactly the way Claire had dreamed it would. Elegant, expensive, perfect. Near the entrance stood a giant seating display framed with white roses and gold lettering. I searched carefully through the names once. Then again, my fingers tightened around my purse strap. Evelyn Harper was not listed anywhere. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. I checked every table twice before finally approaching the young woman organizing guest cards. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I think my seat may have been forgotten." She smiled professionally while flipping through her clipboard. "Last name, Harper." Her expression shifted almost immediately. Not rude, just nervous. "Oh," she said slowly. "I was told you would probably remain downstairs with catering until after the ceremony." Remain downstairs with catering. The sentence landed harder than I expected. Behind me, guests continued laughing, taking photos beneath flower arches worth more money than my first car. Nobody noticed the bride's mother standing there without a chair in the room. I thanked the woman anyway and stepped aside before my embarrassment became visible. That was when I noticed the wedding program stacked. Near the entrance, Claire and Daniel's names were embossed in gold across the front. Beneath them was a section titled "Special Thanks to Our Families." Daniel's parents were listed first, his grandparents second, an aunt from Boston, 2 cousins from California. My name was nowhere on the page. I stared at it for several seconds before carefully placing the booklet back onto the table. Strange how pain changes as you grow older. When you are young, heartbreak feels loud. At 68, it becomes quieter, colder. Like watching a door slowly close while realizing nobody on the other side plans to open it again. A few minutes later, I saw Claire across the ballroom posing for photographs beside Daniel's family. Her white satin gown shimmered beneath the chandeliers while guests admired her like she belonged in a magazine. For one brief second, our eyes met across the crowded room. I thought maybe she would come over. Maybe she would remember who taught her how to walk in high heels by holding both her trembling hands in our tiny apartment kitchen 20 years earlier. But instead, she looked away. Then she leaned toward the photographer and smiled wider. The ceremony began 10 minutes later, and I watched most of it from the hallway outside the ballroom doors. Every now and then, one of the hotel staff pushed through carrying trays of champagne or fresh linens, giving me brief glimpses inside. Claire walked down the aisle beneath white orchids while a string quartet played softly near the stage. Guests stood smiling, some even wiping tears from their eyes. From where I stood, she looked radiant, confident, untouchable, and for a moment, despite everything, I still felt proud of her. That was the terrible thing about being a mother. Love did not disappear simply because respect had. After the ceremony ended, guests flowed toward the cocktail lounge while the ballroom staff prepared dinner service. I remained near the side corridor beside a large arrangement of white roses taller than I was. Nobody seemed quite sure where to place me. One young coordinator asked if I needed a tray to carry. Another handed me a bottle of water without looking directly at me. I accepted both mistakes quietly. Across the room, Claire laughed beside Daniel while photographers circled them like birds around sunlight. She looked completely different from the little girl I used to wait for outside dance practice every Thursday evening. Back then, Claire would run into my arms the second class ended, her tiny ballet shoes hanging from one hand while she talked nonstop during the drive home. "Did you see me spin, Mom?" she would ask every single week. And every single week, I told her she was the most graceful girl in the room, even on nights when my feet ached from working double shifts at the diner. I remembered driving home through snowstorms in my old Chevrolet with the heater barely working, one hand on the steering wheel, and the other holding a cup of instant soup because we could not afford takeout. I remembered clipping grocery coupons at midnight after Claire went to sleep, selling my piano after Thomas got sick, quietly cashing out part of my retirement fund to help pay for Claire's college apartment because she cried on the phone and said she felt embarrassed living farther from campus than her friends. "One day I will repay you for everything," she promised me back then. I never wanted repayment. I only wanted to remain part of her life once she reached the world she dreamed about. Around 7:30, guests finally moved into the ballroom for dinner. I followed the crowd slowly, hoping perhaps a chair had been added somewhere after all. Near the back wall beside the kitchen entrance stood a small table with 3 vendor meals arranged on paper plates. Turkey, green beans, mashed potatoes already turning cold beneath silver foil. A folded card rested beside one of the chairs. Staff. I stared at it for several seconds before sitting down quietly. Nobody told me to sit there. Nobody had to. Nearby, 2 bartenders discussed vacation plans while eating quickly between service rounds. One of them nodded kindly toward me. Long night, he asked. Something like that, I answered again. It was strange how invisible a person could become in a room filled with hundreds of people. Not erased loudly. Not publicly rejected. Just slowly. Repositioned until everyone accepted the new arrangement without question. I looked across the ballroom toward the sweetheart table glowing beneath candlelight and flowers. Claire lifted her champagne glass while guests applauded. Daniel kissed her cheek gently as cameras flashed around them. And sitting there beside the swinging kitchen doors with steam drifting from industrial ovens behind me, I suddenly realized something painful. My daughter had not hidden me downstairs because she was overwhelmed. She had hidden me because somewhere along the way, I had become evidence of the life she no longer wanted attached to hers. About halfway through dinner, I excused myself from the small staff table and walked toward the restroom near the east hallway. I needed a moment away from the noise, away from the smell of roasted meat and expensive perfume and polished champagne glasses reflecting light everywhere I turned. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter now, lined with framed mirrors and soft golden sconces that made everyone look warmer than they really were. As I passed one of the private lounge areas, I heard Claire's voice drifting through the half-open door. I just could not risk her embarrassing me tonight, she said softly. I stopped without meaning to. Another woman laughed gently. Honestly, nobody would even guess she is your mother. There was a pause before Claire answered. That is kind of the point. Something inside me went very still after that. Not shattered. Not dramatic. Just still. I stood there staring at the carpet pattern beneath my shoes while the conversation continued behind the door like ordinary background noise. Daniel's parents already had concerns, Claire explained. His mother keeps asking where my family summers and what clubs we belonged to growing up. So what did you tell them? Someone asked. Claire laughed quietly. That my father built an investment company before he passed. Which technically is not a lie. Technically. Thomas had owned a tiny accounting office with 3 employees above a pharmacy on Oak Street. He worked 60-hour weeks balancing payrolls for local businesses until cancer hollowed him into a shadow during the last year of his life. Investment company. The words sounded almost elegant compared to the truth. And your mother? Another voice asked carefully. Claire lowered hers before answering, but I still heard every word. I told them she mostly stayed out of the public side of things. Public side of things. I closed my eyes for a moment. 27 years earlier, there had been nights when I stood on aching feet pouring coffee for strangers until 2 in the morning because Claire needed braces and Thomas's medical insurance barely covered his treatments. I remembered sewing the hem of Claire's prom dress by hand because we could not afford alterations. I remembered smiling through exhaustion while helping her pack for Northwestern University, slipping $20 bills into her coat pockets so she would not feel different from wealthier students. Back then, she used to hug me tightly before leaving home after holidays. I will make you proud someday, she would whisper. I never imagined success would require rewriting where she came from. The lounge door suddenly opened wider and 2 bridesmaids stepped out laughing with champagne glasses in hand. I turned away quickly before anyone noticed me standing there. My reflection flashed briefly in the mirror across the hallway. Silver hair carefully curled that morning. Pearl earrings catching soft light. Navy dress pressed neatly despite hours spent beside industrial kitchens. I looked exactly like what I was. An aging woman who had spent most of her life making sacrifices nobody remembered once the rewards finally arrived. When I returned toward the ballroom entrance, a middle-aged man near the guest book smiled politely at me and asked, "Excuse me, could someone from catering bring more sparkling water to table 7? For a second, neither of us moved. Then I simply nodded and said, "I will let someone know." The man thanked me warmly before turning back toward his conversation. I walked past him slowly, feeling something shift deep inside my chest. Not rage, not heartbreak, clarity. Because humiliation only works when you still hope the people hurting you might suddenly remember your worth. And standing there beneath those chandeliers, listening to strangers mistake me for hired staff, while my own daughter erased me piece by piece from her carefully constructed world. I realized Claire had spent years trying to become someone new. The painful part was understanding that to build her new identity, she had decided her mother no longer fit inside it. By the time dessert was served, the ballroom had grown louder with wine and celebration. Guests leaned closer across candlelit tables while the band shifted into softer music near the dance floor. Laughter rolled through the room in waves, warm and effortless, the kind shared by people who felt completely comfortable belonging where they stood. I remained near the back corridor beside the service entrance, watching quietly as waiters carried slices of wedding cake beneath crystal lights. Every once in a while, someone glanced past me without really seeing me there. It amazed me how quickly people accepted the role they believed you occupied. A woman holding a silver clutch handed me her empty champagne glass without a word. Another guest smiled politely and asked where the restrooms were. I answered kindly both times. Not because I worked there. Because dignity did not disappear simply because other people failed to recognize it. Near 8:30, Daniel's mother approached the coffee station where I stood alone stirring cream into a cup I did not really want. Patricia Whitmore looked exactly like the women Claire used to describe admiring during college. Elegant cashmere shawl, diamond bracelet, perfect posture that somehow made everyone around her feel less polished by comparison. She smiled at me politely. "You have been very helpful tonight," she said. "Claire mentioned the hotel staff has been wonderful." For one brief moment, I considered correcting her. I imagined watching confusion spread across her face after realizing she had mistaken the bride's mother for catering. But exhaustion settled heavier than pride. "That is kind of you," I answered softly instead. Patricia glanced toward the ballroom where Claire laughed beside a cluster of guests near the dance floor. "She is a lovely girl," she continued. "Daniel is fortunate." I followed her gaze quietly. "Yes," I said after a long pause. "He is." Patricia smiled once more before returning to the reception. The conversation lasted less than a minute, yet somehow it hurt more than everything else combined. Not because she had insulted me. She had not. The pain came from understanding how thoroughly Claire had erased me from the story of her own life. Upstairs in this glittering ballroom, she had become someone polished and socially effortless, a woman who belonged among wealth and old family names and country club conversations. And apparently, mothers like me no longer matched the image. I walked slowly toward the side hallway again, needing air. The noise of the reception faded slightly once the ballroom doors closed behind me. Downstairs, the kitchen staff prepared late-night coffee service while stacks of silver trays rattled softly against industrial sinks. One of the younger servers offered me a fresh cup of tea. "Long evening?" she asked gently. There was no mockery in her voice. Just kindness. Real kindness. "Very," I admitted quietly. She leaned against the counter beside me for a moment. "My mother used to work weddings," she said. "She always told me the people standing quietly in the corners usually carry the heaviest stories." I smiled faintly at that. Strange how compassion often arrived from strangers while cruelty arrived dressed as family. A few minutes later, I heard applause erupt upstairs as Claire and Daniel began their first dance. Through the narrow service window beside the kitchen doors, I could see fragments of the ballroom glowing gold beneath the chandeliers. Claire rested her head lightly against Daniel's shoulder while guests watched with soft smiles and lifted phones recording every perfect second. And standing there hidden beside stacks of folded linen napkins and industrial coffee machines, I finally stopped asking myself what I had done wrong. Some truths arrive slowly. Others settle all at once like winter ice. Claire was not ashamed because I failed her. She was ashamed because I reminded her of the life she had spent years trying to outrun. The small apartment. The secondhand furniture. The mother who worked double shifts and still smelled faintly of diner coffee, no matter how carefully she washed her hands before school events. Success had not changed my daughter into a cruel person overnight. It had simply revealed the parts of her character that comfort and ambition no longer bothered to hide. Around 9 o'clock, the reception shifted into the kind of celebration people remember for years. The band grew louder. Shoes came off beneath tables. Champagne glasses stayed full faster than servers could clear them away. Through the ballroom windows, downtown Chicago shimmered against the dark lake beyond the hotel towers. Everything looked cinematic from a distance, beautiful enough to hide the fractures underneath. I remained near the service corridor listening to the muffled music while folding my coat carefully over one arm. I had already decided I would leave quietly after the cake cutting. There seemed little reason to stay where my presence had become an inconvenience carefully disguised as logistics. Just as I reached for my purse, I heard someone call my name behind me. Evelyn. The voice startled me because it carried genuine warmth. I turned and saw Samuel Reed walking down the hallway toward me, still wearing the same charcoal suit he used to wear to Thomas's office Christmas dinners years ago. Time had silvered his hair and softened his face slightly, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. Samuel, I said quietly, surprised. I did not know you were invited. Technically, I was not, he admitted with a faint smile. Daniel asked me to stop by briefly regarding some legal documents after the honeymoon. He paused then, studying my expression more carefully. Are you all right? It was such a simple question, yet hearing someone ask it sincerely nearly unraveled something inside me. I nodded automatically anyway. Of course. Samuel glanced toward the ballroom entrance where music pulsed beneath the chandeliers. Thomas used to do the exact same thing whenever he was upset, he said softly. Smile first. Speak later. At the mention of my husband's name, the hallway suddenly felt smaller, colder. Samuel had handled Thomas's estate after the funeral 3 years earlier. He knew exactly how hard those months had been. He also knew how much Thomas worried about me once he was gone. I miss him every day, I admitted quietly. Samuel nodded once. I know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Nearby, a server pushed past carrying empty dessert trays while laughter echoed faintly from the ballroom. Finally, Samuel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a large cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. My name was written across the front in Thomas's handwriting. My chest tightened instantly. What is this? I asked. Samuel hesitated before answering. Your husband left additional instructions regarding the family trust, he said carefully. He asked me to wait until Claire's wedding day before delivering them. I stared at the envelope without touching it. Why tonight? Samuel's expression changed slightly then, something almost sad passing behind his eyes. Because Thomas worried that once Claire entered Daniel Whitmore's social world, she might begin valuing appearances more than loyalty. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. Even now, years after his death, Thomas somehow understood things I had refused to see clearly myself. Samuel lowered his voice. There are clauses attached to the trust, Evelyn. Specific protections for you. Protections. The words settled heavily between us. Upstairs, applause erupted again from the ballroom, while someone tapped a champagne glass requesting another toast. Samuel handed me the envelope slowly. I think your husband suspected there might come a day when you would feel alone in your own family, he said quietly. My fingers trembled slightly as I accepted it. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Across the seal, Thomas's handwriting curved neatly beneath the ballroom lights. For Evelyn. Always. I stared at those 2 words for several long seconds while everything around me blurred softly into noise and music and crystal light. Then, for the first time that entire evening, something inside me stopped shrinking. Because humiliation loses part of its power the moment you realize someone once loved you deeply enough to prepare for the possibility that others someday would not. The envelope remained in my hands for several minutes after Samuel walked back toward the ballroom. I stood alone near the service hallway staring at Thomas's handwriting while music drifted faintly through the hotel walls. For Evelyn. Always. My husband had been gone 3 years, yet somehow those words still carried more tenderness than anything I had heard from my daughter all evening. I carefully slid one finger beneath the seal and unfolded the documents inside. The first page contained legal language I barely processed at first, paragraphs discussing the Harper family trust and conditional inheritance clauses attached to Claire's future access. But halfway down the second page, my eyes stopped on a sentence that made my breath catch. In the event that my daughter knowingly humiliates, neglects, or intentionally excludes her mother from significant family milestones, her primary beneficiary status shall be subject to immediate review and possible revocation. I read the line twice, then a third time. The ballroom erupted in applause somewhere above me while guests celebrated another toast, completely unaware that the foundation beneath Claire's carefully constructed world had just begun to crack. Thomas worried she would become ashamed of where she came from. Samuel said quietly after returning beside me a few moments later. I looked up slowly. He wrote this years ago? Samuel nodded. About 6 months before he passed. My chest tightened painfully. Why would he think Claire could do something like this? Samuel hesitated before answering. Because he noticed changes before you allowed yourself to. The words stung because they were true. Thomas had seen the small signs long before I stopped making excuses for them. The way Claire corrected my grammar at restaurants once she entered law school social circles. The way she slowly stopped inviting me to alumni dinners or company events. The embarrassment hidden beneath her smile whenever I mentioned old family stories in front of wealthier friends. I had spent years convincing myself those moments were harmless. Temporary. Growing. Pains. Mothers are experts at softening painful truths about their children because accepting them feels too much like failure. Samuel glanced toward the ballroom entrance. There is more, he said carefully. He pointed toward the final section of the documents. Claire believes the trust transfers fully after tonight. I looked back down at the papers. It does not. No, he answered calmly. The final authorization still belongs entirely to you. Silence settled between us after that. Not angry silence. Something colder. Clearer. Upstairs, the band transitioned into an old Frank Sinatra song Thomas used to hum while cooking breakfast on Sunday mornings. The sound drifted faintly through the ceiling vents, almost ghost-like. For a brief second, memories hit me so sharply I could practically see him standing beside our kitchen stove in faded jeans, flipping pancakes while Claire danced around the apartment barefoot as a little girl. Back then, family had felt simple, honest. None of us cared about designer labels or private clubs or pretending to belong somewhere else. We belonged to each other. Mrs. Harper? A voice interrupted gently behind me. One of the wedding coordinators stood nearby holding a microphone. The bride just requested that all immediate family gather near the ballroom for speeches. Immediate family. The phrase almost made me smile. Samuel looked at me carefully, as though waiting to see whether I would refuse. Instead, I folded the documents neatly back into the envelope and straightened the sleeves of my navy dress. Something inside me had changed during the last half hour. The sadness remained, but the desperation was gone. I no longer needed Claire to suddenly remember my value in order to believe I had won. Thank you, I told the coordinator softly. Then I lifted my chin slightly and began walking toward the ballroom entrance, carrying the envelope in one hand while crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across the polished marble floor ahead of me. When I stepped back into the ballroom, the room had softened into that golden late evening glow weddings always seem to carry. Candles flickered across white linen tables. Half-finished champagne glasses reflected chandelier light like scattered stars. Guests leaned comfortably into conversations while the band played quietly near the dance floor. For the first time all evening, nobody stopped me at the entrance. Nobody redirected me toward the kitchen or asked me to wait elsewhere. I walked slowly across the marble floor holding Thomas's envelope against my side, and although dozens of people surrounded me, I no longer felt invisible. Near the front of the ballroom, Claire stood beside Daniel smiling for photographs with several guests from his law firm. The moment she noticed me approaching, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not guilt. Alarm. She excused herself quickly and crossed the room before I reached the sweetheart table. Mom, she said under her breath, forcing a smile for nearby guests. Where have you been? Such a strange question after spending the entire evening making sure I stayed hidden. Around, I answered calmly. Claire glanced toward the envelope in my hand. What is that? Something your father left for me. At the mention of Thomas, her posture stiffened slightly. This is not really the best time for serious conversations, she said quietly. Everyone is about to start speeches. Before I could answer, the master of ceremonies tapped his microphone near the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced warmly. Before we continue tonight's celebration, the bride requested a few words from close family and friends. Claire's eyes widened almost instantly. Mom, she whispered sharply, please do not make this awkward. Awkward. The words settled between us like ice. I looked at my daughter carefully then, truly carefully, perhaps for the first time in years. Her makeup remained flawless beneath the ballroom lights. Her white satin gown shimmered elegantly as guests watched from nearby tables. She looked successful, beautiful, perfectly composed. Yet beneath all of it, I suddenly saw something smaller. Fear. Not fear of embarrassment. Fear of losing control over the image she had worked so hard to build. The microphone was handed toward me before Claire could stop it. Several guests turned, politely, expecting a sentimental speech from the bride's mother. Somewhere across the ballroom, I noticed Patricia Whitmore watching with mild curiosity while Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside his chair. I accepted the microphone gently. For a moment, the room quieted except for the soft clink of silverware and distant traffic beyond the hotel windows. "Good evening," I began calmly. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. "I have spent most of tonight watching my daughter celebrate the beginning of a beautiful new life." Claire lowered her eyes immediately. "When Claire was 8 years old," I continued softly, "she used to practice ballet in our apartment kitchen because we could not afford a studio every week. She would spin across the linoleum floor while I cooked dinner beside her." A few guests smiled politely. When she was 16, she wanted the same prom dress as the wealthier girls at school. I remember sewing extra fabric into the hem at 2 o'clock in the morning because buying a new one was outside our budget. The ballroom had grown very still now. Even the servers paused near the walls. And when she was 22 and afraid she would never fit into the world she dreamed about, her father and I emptied part of our retirement savings so she could start her life without fear. Claire stared at the floor while Daniel's expression slowly changed beside her. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. That was the strange thing about truth. Spoken quietly enough, it forced people to listen harder. I looked toward my daughter one final time before continuing. Every parent hopes their child reaches places they themselves never could. But somewhere along the way, success can become dangerous if it teaches us that love should only be visible when it is convenient. Silence spread across the ballroom so completely that even the music had stopped. For several long seconds after I finished speaking, nobody in the ballroom moved. The silence felt heavier than any argument ever could. Crystal chandeliers glowed softly above hundreds of frozen expressions while the band members stood motionless near the dance floor, unsure whether to continue playing. Claire remained beside the sweetheart table staring downward, her hands clasped tightly against the satin fabric of her gown. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her, glancing between me and the guests surrounding them. I lowered the microphone slowly, prepared to walk away quietly and let the evening continue. But before I could step back, Samuel Reed stood from his table near the center of the ballroom. "Excuse me," he said calmly, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Every head turned toward him. Samuel adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket before continuing. "As attorney for the Harper Family Trust, there is an important matter requiring acknowledgement tonight." Claire's face lost color almost instantly. "Samuel," she whispered sharply, "not here." But Samuel remained composed. "Your father specifically requested these instructions be addressed on your wedding day." Guests exchanged confused glances while Patricia Whitmore slowly straightened in her chair. Daniel looked toward Claire with growing concern. Samuel opened a leather folder in his hands and spoke evenly, professionally, without drama. "The Harper Family Trust contains a conditional clause protecting Mrs. Evelyn Harper from intentional humiliation, exclusion, or neglect by any primary beneficiary." A ripple of confusion spread quietly across nearby tables. Claire stared at him in disbelief. "What are you doing?" she hissed under her breath. Samuel continued calmly. "Due to events observed and documented this evening, Mrs. Harper now retains sole discretion regarding future distribution of all trust assets." The room fell completely silent again. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a champagne glass clinked softly against a plate. Claire looked at me then for the first time all evening with something real in her eyes. "Panic. Mom," she said quickly, stepping closer. "Please do not do this here." But the strange thing was, I no longer felt angry enough to want revenge. The hurt remained, yes, deeply, but beneath it sat something steadier now. Peace. I reached into the envelope Thomas had left me and removed the final signed document Samuel prepared earlier that evening. "Your father spent his last months worrying about what would happen after he was gone," I said quietly. Claire's breathing grew uneven. "Mom, I can explain." I shook my head gently. "No, Claire. You already did." My voice never rose. That was what unsettled the room most. There was no scene, no cruelty, only truth finally standing where silence used to be. I turned slightly, so my words reached the entire ballroom. Tonight reminded me that money cannot repair what respect no longer protects. Then, beneath the warm chandelier light, I signed the document transferring the majority of the Harper Trust into a scholarship foundation supporting widowed women returning to school later in life. Women who spent years sacrificing quietly for families who often forgot their names once success arrived. Samuel accepted the signed papers silently. Across the room, several guests lowered their eyes. Patricia Whitmore looked stunned. Daniel appeared unable to speak. And Claire simply stood there in the center of her perfect wedding reception, realizing too late that wealth inherited without gratitude rarely remains inherited for long. I placed the pen back onto the table carefully before smoothing the sleeves of my navy dress. I truly hope you have a beautiful marriage, I told my daughter softly. And I meant it. Then I turned and walked slowly toward the ballroom exit. Nobody stopped me this time. Near the kitchen corridor, one of the young servers hurried forward holding my coat. "Mrs. Harper," she said gently, "you forgot this." I smiled at her warmly while slipping several folded bills from my purse into her hand. "Thank you for treating me kindly tonight," I said. Her eyes softened immediately. Outside the hotel, cold Chicago air wrapped around me as traffic lights shimmered across rain-dark streets. Behind the ballroom windows high above, I could still see guests moving beneath golden chandeliers while music finally resumed inside. My daughter remained somewhere up there surrounded by flowers and crystal and the fragile life she had fought so hard to enter. But for the first time in years, I no longer felt small standing outside it. Because that night, I stopped begging to be loved by people who only valued me when I stayed hidden.